thank you everyone for joining. I think we're going to get started here right now. Again, we're here for Across the Aisle, the Hill's open mic, and we are very lucky to have with us today Senator Trent Lott, who served in the Senate for many years, Republican from Mississippi, and Senator Tom Daschle, Democrat from South Dakota. So thank you to both of our guests for coming and for joining. We're going to have a great conversation here, wide-ranging bipartisanship, news of the day of what's happening on Capitol Hill, and really whatever you guys, the viewers at home are watching, want to hear. You guys can submit questions in the Q&A button down below. My colleague Lisa Williams, who is on here with us right now, she will read some of the questions, give some of you guys an opportunity to read your questions yourself to Senators Lott and Daschle, whatever may be on your mind. So with that, let's kick it off. Senators, you guys are known for your bipartisanship and the way that you guys worked together when you were in the Senate, both as minority leader, majority leader, and the opposite, majority leader, minority leader. So much so that you co-authored a book, Crisis Point, Why We Must and How We Can Overcome Our Broken Politics in Washington and Across America. So on that note, I kind of want to dive into this topic of bipartisanship. Right now, we're living in such a polarized moment, such harsh partisan politics. Is it possible for bipartisan to still exist and shine through these partisan lines? Congressman Lott, Senator Lott, we'll start with you, and then Senator Daschle will get your thoughts as well.
Well, first of all, I want to say how much I always enjoyed and admired and appreciated the ability to work with Tom Daschle when he was a Democratic leader. And as you noted, we went back and forth, majority, minority. But I knew that I could always trust Tom to be honest with me. We tried not to surprise each other. And and I think the fact that our states maybe have pretty much a lot in common, we're a lot of rural areas, farm and agriculture. So we had a lot of reasons to be able to work together. Now, it was a different time. The people were different in the Congress in many respects, and the media was different. We didn't have this around-the-clock social media to deal with like we do now, but it certainly was a great pleasure and an honor for me to work with Tom Daschle. We became good friends, and we are till this day.
Well, Senator Daschle, your thoughts
Michael,
here?
First of all, let me just say thank you for having us on. We're really looking forward to the conversation. And I have to just say I really treasure Trent Lott's friendship, and we became legislative partners, and that partnership developed into a friendship. And I think we got a lot done. And I think it was a time when Congress was more functional, but as Trent so ably said, times were different. He and I both talk about the airplane and how the airplane has affected the way Congress works. People leave on Thursday and they come back on Tuesday, and we try to run the country on Wednesday, and social media didn't exist virtually at all. Cable news really didn't exist that much. And so it was a different time. But to your question, is bipartisanship possible? I think it's still happening. I think it's below the surface. You've got a good example right now with a Republican and a Democratic senator on sanctions on Russia, working together to pass legislation on sanctions on Russia. So it's another example. There are a lot of other examples. It is much more polarized, but I think it has to start with leadership, and leadership needs to demonstrate that bipartisanship is part of what really makes Congress work well.
I have people that say to me, "Oh, well, it was so different. Y'all didn't have the problems that we have now when you and Tom was leadership." Well, we did have to deal with 9/11. We had the Iraq War resolution. We had the impeachment trial of William Jefferson Clinton, and we found a way to get through all those without blowing the place up, and coming to what we thought was a reasonable conclusion and solution. So we dealt with some tough issues.
That's something I want to dive in on. There's certainly a lot of polarization right now based on, current events and just the current climate in Washington and beyond. But you guys didn't have it easy either. As you mentioned, the President Clinton impeachment trial, you guys were in leadership right after 9/11, the anthrax attack as well, the Iraq war. There was still certainly a lot going on. Senator Lott, you mentioned that you never surprised each other. I'm wondering if you could sort of take us behind the scenes of what that communication looked like, how you you two built this such a strong working relationship despite the partisan lines being drawn. And again, the really heated, intense political moment that you were living in.
Well, no, the center aisle in the Senate is not a wall. It's very easy to cross the aisle, and I had no problem walking over to Tom's side of the chamber, or he came over to my side, and we talked. And when I first got elected, I think I promised him that I'd try to be fair with him, and I'd try not to surprise him. Every now and then, I'd get a little out of control, and sometime I pushed the envelope too much. I remember one time I did a thing called filling up the tree to block all the amendments. And then I came to my senses and I went over to Tom and said, sorry about that, and unraveled what I had done. So that was, and I knew that I could count on Tom, to be honest with me. And we would always meet on the floor of the Senate at the beginning of the day and say, okay, here are the issues that we're going to take up today. We made it work, and it can do that now too.
The key is communication. And Trent, usually Trent talks about something else that I think made a difference. We had a phone. We had a phone on our desks that only we answered. If that phone rang, I knew it was Trent Lott. It wasn't going to be his staff. It wasn't going to be anybody else. It was going to be Trent. And I knew it was probably pretty important, or he wouldn't be calling me. And I really think communication is so critical, and we communicated from the very beginning. And and I think he's right. I think we both had House experience, and that helped us sort of understand kind of what we wanted and what we didn't want in the Senate. And we learned, that there are pluses and minuses to being in these roles. But I think those mutual experiences helped us communicate. But that phone was a big factor.
Yeah. Yeah, and honestly, sometimes we were even trying to get around our own staff. We'd get very nervous when my staff would see me going across the aisle to talk to Tom to work something out because they weren't sure what was going to happen. But Tom is absolutely right. You need that communication, and in those leadership roles in the Senate, you have to do it every day. If you're doing it every day, it gets to be easier, and I think it helps the institution.
Sometimes it's not smoke-filled rooms. Sometimes it's just the Senate floor in the broad daylight. I want to move into current events a little bit because I was so looking forward to this conversation, particularly because of the times that you guys had served. Senator Lott, you were majority leader when the Bush tax cuts were signed into law. You helped usher that through the trifecta through budget reconciliation. Senator Daschle, you were the minority leader at that time, helping steer Democrats through that situation and that legislative undertaking. Fast forward just a few years, we're sort of seeing the same exact situation play out right now. So, Senator Lott, I'm curious, do you have any advice for Republican leadership on ushering a massive tax cut package through a Republican trifecta? Of course, the House has just passed the bill. The Senate looking at some changes. We'll ping pong back to the House. And then folks are hoping it could be done at President Trump's desk by July 4th. And then Senator Daschle, any advice for Democratic leadership as they traverse this minority wilderness as the Republicans are pushing through a marquee bill?
My first advice on taxes is, while I'm very much for it as a general principle, be careful you don't overdo it. If it's not done in a way that incentivizes growth and activity, it's just sort of a tax break for everybody without real economic consequences. It can be a mistake, and that's what I'm watching right now in the reconciliation bill that the Senate is working on. The House just passed. They got an awful lot of tax cuts in there that ordinarily would not have been considered. One other side point. I think that one of the most important things that we did was working with Bill Clinton to get a balanced budget. I was meeting this past week with a number of my Democratic friends in Mississippi, and they were complaining about the budget thing. I said, well, just remember this. Bill Clinton came into office and he made a pledge that the era of big government was over. And then for 2 years, we worked with him in a bipartisan way to get savings on spending. We've changed some programs, work requirements, all of that. And we got to the point where we actually got to a tough agreement. It was tough for Tom and it was for us too, but we got to agreement on a balanced budget and 2 years of a surplus. It wasn't easy, and it did take 2 or 3 years, but a lot of credit goes to Bill Clinton.
Well, I just couldn't emphasize enough what Trent just said. I don't think reconciliation is the right model. I think it's actually reconciliation implies that you're going to do it alone. And the reason we had 3 years of balanced budget and surplus is because it was bipartisan. Just remember, right now, spending is 23% of GDP. Taxes are 17% of GDP. That's a 6% gap. And Trent mentioned when we negotiated in the 90s with President Clinton that it was tough. It was really tough. And you know why it was tough? Because Democrats had to agree to a lot of major spending cuts, and Republicans had to agree to major revenue increases. Both were on the table, revenue increases and spending cuts. And that is tough. That takes a lot of courage and a lot of leadership. And but we got it done, and that to me is the model. You got to have everything on the table if you're serious. I don't think this $37 trillion federal debt is sustainable. I think the fact we're in an economic growth period. We ought to have a surplus right now, not a deficit, and yet we're going to have a $2 trillion deficit this year. What happens when the next recession comes along? And we're going to have to borrow another $2 or $3 trillion on top. I got to tell you, I'm really worried about the currency and what it may mean for the value of the dollar, and whether or not we can get people to continue to buy American currency around the world. So there's a lot of issues around this debt that I'm very concerned about. This is not sustainable. But the only way we're really going to address it is not with another $2 trillion deficit, but by putting everything on the table and getting the job done, just like we were able to do. And I hate Trent and I usually never like to say do it the way we did it.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to imply that they should do exactly what we did last time, but there is a value in doing something together. And Trent's heard me say this a million times, but compromise is the oxygen of democracy, and I think that's what we need here.
Talk about the balanced budget amendment, balancing the budget during the Clinton administration. I'm up in the Capitol every day, and I'm constantly hearing folks talk about the ballooning deficit, wanting to bring the deficit down, and thinking back to the Clinton administration when the deficit was neutral. And as you mentioned, when there were those years of a surplus, what were those conversations like of bringing that idea to fruition? As you mentioned, it required some serious negotiating and concessions on both sides of the aisle.
Without being critical of either Democrat or Republican presidents of late, it really does begin at the top. Bill Clinton was determined to get it done, and we didn't do it in a month or two. It actually was a 2-year run-up, and even the last day when we were still negotiating, he called and he wanted a little more addition of spending in a certain area, and I said, "No, Mr. President, we can't do it." I understand that when he hung up the phone, he was not real happy with me. But later on that day, they called, his chief of staff, Erskine Bowles, called Tom and me and said, "Okay, we have a deal." But it was not easy, and it took a lot of leadership at the top to get it done.
I couldn't agree more. That the problem we have is that right now, for the last 20 years, deficits haven't mattered.
Yeah.
We went through COVID, deficits didn't matter. We went through 2 wars, deficits didn't matter. And we just kept piling on the debt over and over and over again. And now we're in what I consider catastrophic circumstances. And we can't continue to do this. And it just seems to me that there is only one solution. And Democrats have said spending shouldn't be on the table, and Republicans have said revenue shouldn't be on the table. And we both want to spend more, and we want to cut taxes more, and that's going to lead to more debt. And that's just not a viable future for us.
Another question I wanted to bring in, talking about news of the day, one theme that's been sort of a constant through this second iteration of the Trump administration has been the legislative branch ceding power to the executive branch. We've seen Republicans particularly be okay with with President Trump signing a number of executive orders on areas where Congress would have jurisdiction. We've seen Congressional Republicans take the step of preventing the Congress from pushing back on the president's tariffs, an area that is typically under the jurisdiction of Congress. Curious to get your thoughts on this power dynamic we're currently seeing in Washington, and if you think it's dangerous for, the future of the separation of powers and sort of how Washington functions.
I started watching this pretty closely all the way back to 1968 when I actually was a Democratic staff member for the Rules Committee in the House and then elected in 72. But way back then, even with Nixon, I started the feeling that we were ceding too much authority. And it's continued with every president. The presidents get more and more and more authority. These executive orders that, President Trump has been rolling them out. A lot of that, I think, should require legislative activity. And for instance, I grew up saying and thinking tariffs are not a good idea. And now we're right in the middle of what do we do with tariffs. So I do think Congress has ceded too much authority to presidents of both parties. And just like right now, I think that the Congress should step up and have something to say about, for instance, what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. Where are they? And Frank, I'm not real sure where America is right now on that very important issue.
One of my favorite stories is a true story. I got elected leader by one vote in 1994, and I got invited to have my first meeting with President Clinton, one-on-one. I had met with him many times in a group, but never one-on-one. So I went to one of my mentors, Senator Byrd, and I told Senator Byrd I was going to go meet with President Clinton for the first time one-on-one. What should I tell him? And Senator Byrd looked at me and he said, "You tell President Clinton that you'll work with him, not for him." And I think that's about the best advice I ever got as leader. We're a co-equal branch. We ought to be working with any administration, not for them. But I agree with Trent. Over the last 40 years, more and more, we've begun to work for a president, and that's not good for the country.
I want to toss the conversation over to my colleague, Lisa Williams now. She's been looking at questions that have been sent in by our viewers, and she's going to read off a couple for the senators.
Hi, I do have a question from Todd from South Dakota. Both of you senators were well known for working together and getting results. That is missed so much. Would either or both of you even consider servicing in a Congress like we have now?
Well, first of all, because you're from South Dakota, Todd, thank you for joining us. I'm very, very proud of our state and our people in particular. The answer to your question is yes. I just think public service is one of the highest callings in any society. And some of the most rewarding years of my life were the ones I spent in Congress, largely because I had the good fortune to work with people of the caliber and quality of Trent Lott. But I would encourage anybody in this country. We owe it to our country to give back, whether we're in the armed forces or in any government service role. But Congress is a high calling, and it's an honor to serve. And I would strongly urge people to consider running now.
I had a good friend of mine ask me recently, would I do it again? And the answer is, yeah, absolutely. I would run again. And I would try to be in the leadership 35 years in the Congress. And I live the American dream. I'm the son of a shipyard worker, a pipe fitter, union member. My mother was a school teacher, came from a rural area in Mississippi, kind of like Tom up there in South Dakota. And, the good Lord blessed me in so many ways. But I also had enough sense to finally decide after 35 years and 4 years as staff member, hey, maybe it's time that I check it to the next guy. And I was succeeded by former staff member, Senator Roger Wicker, who's now chairman of the Armed Services Committee and doing a great job. I made the right decision, and we elected a good man to pick up the baton and carry on.
And then Lisa, any more questions from the viewers? And then I've got a couple myself that I'm itching to ask, but one more for the viewer.
Yes, I have two that I'm actually going to combine into one. They're from Rhonda from Pennsylvania and Amanda from Washington. In the culture of incivility, any suggestions on how cooperation between members of different parties can show the world that they are able to work collaboratively? And then the second one, what is one of the best ways to effectively engage to influence change within these bodies?
We had a lot of really good relationships. I don't want to overdo this, but we had prayer groups together. And whenever we had a major issue for our country, we tried to make it bipartisan. And that makes the whole thing work better when you have a team effort, whether it's on defense or taxes or whatever it might be. But the fact that Congress now doesn't seem to really have time to even get to know each other, those times that we had in private meetings and friendships and dinners and breakfasts made all the difference in our ability to work together. We had a little prayer group, and sometime when I needed a Democrat to help me out, not always Tom, I'd ease over on the Democratic side, see if I couldn't get another co-sponsor, and it helped. They need to do more of that now.
I agree. I think Trent came up with a speaker series that we had. We invited former presidents and former majority leaders to speak in the old Senate chamber, and we did joint caucuses. And I think those joint caucuses sometimes I don't think they happen anymore, and I really think that's unfortunate. You know, the caucuses sometimes tend to become pep rallies. And you know, if you have a joint caucus, you're going to sit next to. We also used to have a small dining room where everybody can come in, and you sat family style, and you'd sit next to two people that you wouldn't be on the same committees with, and that was another little thing that really made a difference. And then I'll say something that may be a little controversial, but I think sometimes if you shut off the C-SPAN cameras, you might have a little better, more,
Yeah.
you know, there's too much playing to the cameras right now, and not enough just talking among ourselves. And I think that you turn the cameras off and people are a little more candid. They're not afraid to be a little more outspoken or honest about how they feel about things, and they're not going to be giving their speech to their base. And so if you had a few moments where you didn't have the cameras, and we had some experiences like that, and they always seem to be pretty productive sessions.
I'll cite the example that Tom has used in the past. It's very apropos. When we had the impeachment trial of President Clinton, for 2 weeks it was all public, and then one night, I think it was a Thursday night, we turned the cameras off, and the staff I don't think the staff was in, it was just the senators. And the quality and the caliber and the seriousness of the speeches were the best I ever heard. I'll never forget it.
I want to sort of build off that note, specifically what Senator Daschle had said. I remember when it was during the 2023 speaker's race, the historic Kevin McCarthy 15 rounds of voting, C-SPAN had taken control of the cameras on the House floor. So there were a number of different angles other than the typical angles of the dais and a few other spots. And there were so many folks who were so surprised at the conversations that we're having on the floor. I recall a lot of folks on Twitter being shocked at Matt Gaetz and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez having a conversation on the House floor. Talk about, you know, these types of relationships do exist. There's so much playing for the camera of social media and the cable news era right now, but there's also a lot of these substantive conversations that do still happen across the aisle. I'm curious, what's your take on how social media has influenced Congress? It could be a pro in helping folks get their message across, but there's also the reality of folks playing for the camera.
Well, you cite a good example, those multiple nights and votes on who would be Speaker of the House. It was not one of the House's better experiences. And I thought one night they were literally going to come to physical blows. Thank goodness some cooler heads prevented that. But that was not good. And I do think that social media is part of a problem now. You know, everything is out there, and even if you take a courageous position, you can really be hammered. And you know, members have to take in consideration, do I want to continue to do this? So it definitely has had a dampening effect, I think, on the production of members of Congress.
I think there's too much of it, and I worry a little bit also about misinformation. There's just a lot of misinformation in social media, and that makes the effort to try to understand just what the real facts are all the more complicated and challenging. One thing I would also say that I'm very proud of is Trent and I both have worked at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and you know, it's a think tank that really has devoted itself for the last almost 20 years now to try to find opportunities for communication and working out ways with which Republicans and Democrats can work together. And I want to give them a shout out for what they try to do every day.
I agree with Tom on that. And I was involved with the Bipartisan Policy Center, and we used to have some meetings. We'd have Democrats and Republicans on a panel. We have guests there. It was very, very helpful, I think, and I hope they'll continue their good work.
I had mentioned the Kevin McCarthy marathon speakers race, and covering that, spending a lot of hours at the Capitol to cover that. I was just taken aback at the dynamics that go into trying to claim power in Washington. And then I was doing research ahead of this conversation, and I realized that it may not have actually been the craziest example of power agreement and power sharing in Washington. I was just jotting down notes of the timeline in 2001 of what the ping ponging of power between you two had looked like. I'll just read it for our viewers if they're not aware. From 1996 to 2000, the beginning of 2001, Senator Lott, you were the majority leader. Senator Daschle, you were the minority leader. And then on January 3rd, 2001, the new Congress had come in, and it was a 50-50 Congress. But at that time, Al Gore was still the vice president, giving Democrats the tie-breaking vote, which made Senator Daschle majority leader and Senator Lott minority leader. Fast forward a few days to January 20th. At that time, President Bush was sworn in, which then gave Republicans the edge, with Senator Cheney once again flipping between you two. And then there was a senator who changed his party from caucusing with Republicans to caucusing with Democrats in the middle of 2001, once again flipping between you two. So a couple of things there, just generally, if you could take us behind the scenes and talk about what that was like, just a sheer ping pong and back and forth between being in the majority and being in the minority. And then notably, you guys created a power sharing agreement at that time because it was such interesting dynamics, which, I think in a lot of circumstances would be thought of to be a more difficult feat this year and this era because of the polarization and partisanship. So curious on those two things. I mean, just the back and forth was just, feels like it was exhausting to say. It feels like it may have been exhausting to live.
Well, there's another example about how Tom and I met. We worked it out. We agreed on how we would proceed with a tie situation in the Senate. And he was reasonable, and we came together with what was a good procedure. And by the way, it has been used again since then. But when I took it to the Republican conference to explain what I'd worked out with Tom, I almost lost my leadership position over it. I had some of my good friends that got up and were critical not only of the agreement, but of me for making the agreement. Finally, Pat Roberts, a senator from out west, stood up and said, "What are you talking about? We got a tie vote here." And our leader met with their leader. They came to an agreement. It's time we settle down and just go forward. And that ended it. But it was pretty tough. I was sitting there thinking when I was being criticized, I'm going to have to step aside as leader. And then Pat Roberts saved the day.
I want to pop in here. I'll definitely want to hear your thoughts here. That's so interesting that you had almost lost your leadership position. Was there a moment or a crossroads that you had reached where you were thinking about whether to take the bipartisan, stage or to take the partisan route, which many of your colleagues probably would have preferred at that moment? What was that thought process like?
Well, I mean, it was a tie vote. It had to be bipartisan, and I thought Tom and I worked out something that made a lot of sense. But even one of my good friends, like Bill Graham from Texas, was critical of it. So it was, I guess, the most difficult time I actually had as leader. But we got through it and we went forward. And the record will show in that period where we had the tie, we actually moved some good legislation. We did appropriations, we did a defense bill, we did a No Child Left Behind education bill. It worked, but it was tough, no question.
It's called the organizing resolution, and the reason why it's such a big deal is it has to do with how many members are on each committee, what is the budget for each committee, there's just a lot of really personal, for a lot of members, personal matters. And so, I just give Trent enormous credit for the courage and the leadership he showed. I've always felt that a good leader needs three bones in his skeletal structure. He needs a wishbone, a backbone, and a funny bone. And Trent Lott showed his backbone during that period, and we got a lot done as a result. And I look back at that moment in particular as really one of the most important in our whole leadership tenure.
Yep. By the way, I also, with Tom's support, tried to do some things to make the Senate kind of a little fun. We did have the prayer group breakfast. We had the singing senators. I even tried to make it a bipartisan quartet, but that didn't work out too good. And we had Seersucker Thursday, which is coming up next week in the Senate, where everybody dresses up in their seersucker outfits. And I even had the temerity to wear a kilt on the floor of the Senate. And Senator Kit Bond from Missouri said those are the ugliest legs I've ever seen on the floor of the Senate. But we were serious, but we had some fun together. And that, I think, makes it easier to get good results.
Do you think there's still room for levity, for that kind of levity in the Capitol? There's still Seersucker Thursday, and there's still some other traditions, but it just feels like with the polarization being at an all-time high and the partisanship being at such a high, is there still room for those light moments?
Well, I worry a little bit about the bases. I think the bases put a lot of pressure on members not to do it. I just think that's so unfortunate because, I think the country generally likes to be governed from somewhere in the middle, center right, center left, and in order for that to happen, you have to have that comity, and you have to have that relationship, trust, and ability to communicate, as I said earlier. And levity helps do that. And Trent created an atmosphere when he was leader, and I hope I could contribute the same when I was leader. That we really tried to make it a place with good comity, with a T, not only with a D but with a T, comity. And I think we accomplished that. And you can do it today, but it's just a lot harder.
Senator Lott, any thoughts on that? You're the brainchild of so many of these traditions. Any thoughts on that can still exist today, and if new ones can be introduced?
Well, I enjoy that so much, and I still stay in touch with my former colleagues like Judge Gregg from New Hampshire and John Ashcroft from Missouri. We really formed a bond. And I don't know if they take the time or have the time to do that now. It's like Tom said, they kind of blow into town and they work a couple of days and they're gone again. So I try not to give them a whole lot of advice, but I think it'd be worthwhile for the leadership maybe to get together and talk about how do you make a place a better place to be. And I think that would contribute to a more productive legislation.
Another question I wanted to ask Senator Daschle, what you said had sparked this thought. You mentioned the bases, right? And we're seeing this play out in both parties right now. Democrats running to the left, Republicans running to the right, just moving farther and farther away from this ideological center, or even the center of each of the parties. Do you see that as a politically perilous thing, both for bipartisanship, but also for the trajectory of the parties, that both sides are going to their own respective, further end?
Well, I think Democrats have a real challenge. I've been very, very vocal about it. In the last three presidential races, there are about 3,100 counties in the United States. In the last three presidential races, 1,400 of those 3,100 trended Republican, more in every election. Only 57 trended Democratic in the last three presidential races. So that says all you need to know about the direction of the two parties. About 42 million people trended more Republican, 8 million people trended more Democratic in the last three presidential races. And so I think Democrats have a brand problem, and we've got to recognize it. We've got to deal with it. And I think we've got a lot of work cut out for us.
I really think it's so important for both parties, frankly, to reach out to people with different backgrounds. I noted my father was a shipyard union member. And when I was leader, I met with the union leaders, and I told them, I'm the most, got the most union background of any Republican leader you'll ever meet. It never got to where we work together the way we should. But Republicans have, and Trump, I give him credit, has been able to reach out more to minorities and middle class working people, which is kind of a change from where the parties were in the past. Both parties better be thinking about what the future will hold and what their message is going to be.
I want to toss it back to my colleague Lisa, who has been sifting through all the audience questions, and she's going to queue up a few more. So Lisa, floor is yours.
Sure. I have one from Bruce that I would like to ask. Not really following what we were exactly just talking about, but I think it's a good question. With regard to deficits and debt, what is the political capacity for the U.S. to learn from other more indebted countries, perhaps Japan or Europe?
That one's so tough, I should yield to Tom.
Well, I think we can learn from other countries.
Yeah.
Japan is really struggling. They have even a bigger debt problem right now than we do, and they have another problem that we, at least right now, don't have, and that's a demographic problem. They're losing population dramatically, and actually most of Europe is having that experience as well. So, one of the reasons we haven't had that problem is that we've had a very robust immigration opportunity for years, and we have all this diversity and we have this growth in population as a result. But I think we can look at what other countries have had to face and the challenges that they're facing and learn from each other. And that really takes me to another. I don't think we can be isolationist. I think we've really got to be collaborative with our allies and other countries, and whether it's trade or national security or any one of a number of other challenges we face internationally. I think it's all important, but we certainly can learn from their experiences as well.
When I was elected to the Senate, I succeeded the venerable John Stennis, who was known as the conscience of the Senate, a great guy. And when he retired at Mississippi State University, I went down to see him and I said, "Would you give me some advice about how to be a good senator?" And he said, "Well, I never traveled very much, even though he was chairman of appropriations and chairman of the armed services." He said, "I would urge you to travel, meet the world's leaders, and it'll make you a better leader." And so I took his advice. I went regularly to Europe. I was a supporter of NATO, but I always complained to the Germans, the French, all of them, that you're not living up to your commitment to fund your own defense. I'm pleased now to see that some of them are beginning to get up to the level of commitments of their own defense. But I think it's important for members of Congress to reach out. And I went to Kyiv when it was known as Kiev in Ukraine, and it was an interesting experience when I was there. I went 3 times to Russia, met with Putin a couple of times. Tom and I met with him one time, and they're in the capital. Those meetings are important as an education to our own leaders, but to help us have an influence on other leaders around the world.
Let me just add one more thing to the advantage of traveling, and that is our earlier conversation around building relationships. I always made it a point. I think on every Codel I led, I always had made it bipartisan. Yeah. But you really develop relationships with the members you travel with, and those relationships really spill over when you get back home. You've learned a little bit more. You've met their family. You know a little bit more about their backgrounds, and it really makes a difference in terms of the chemistry you have with members. And so, not only is it an opportunity for us to put a little bit more of an American stamp on foreign policy, it's a good relationship building experience as well.
Yeah.
All right. I have another from Ramona. What role does gerrymandering across the country have in creating divisions in the working environment of Congress?
Well, this is an issue that Tom has emphasized. I remember one time he and I were out in California, and he's talking about how the districts are drawn now, where you've got the districts are clearly Republican or clearly Democrat, and it has affected How many competitive races are there really for particularly in the House of Representatives? They're drawn to where you have clearly Republican district or clearly Democrat district, and it has affected the makeup of particularly the House, and I think, frankly, in a negative way.
I couldn't agree more. Only 10% of House seats today are competitive, about 35 or 40 seats. That's all. And 90% are not competitive. So what does that mean? That means of the two elections, the primary and the general, the primary is the more important election. Because if you win the primary, it's a given you're going to win the general. But what happens in the primary? Well, first of all, you have very low voter turnout. So you get more in my view, more the extreme left and the extreme right that participate because these bases are activated. And because they're activated, they can be very demanding. And so a lot of members don't want to get primaried today. And that really affects how they look at legislative decisions. And I think that's unfortunate. If you're worried about getting primaried, rather than worried about getting generaled, you're probably gonna vote differently. And I think that's created a lot of the polarization we're experiencing now.
Now the question is, what do you do about it? And Tom and I have talked about that when we've been together in different locations. But one state, Washington State, actually came up with a pretty good solution. They actually had, I think, a well-known Democrat, a well-known Republican. They had to agree on how it was done. And I think they came up with a pretty good result. But it's tough because you got to deal with governors, you got to deal with legislators, you got an incumbent congressman that's chairman of the committee. You don't want to undermine his the makeup of his districts, but it is having, I think, I agree with Tom, a negative impact on the makeup of the Congress.
All right, great. I have one from Miley, and I'm sorry if I did not pronounce that correctly. What do you think it will take for the American people to demand that Congress and the White House lay all the cards on the table and truly work to reduce the deficit and not try to score different portions of the budget differently, like delaying cuts or increasing spending out years so that the optics look like there is a reduction?
Well, that's what that we're dealing with right now. You don't seem to see a lot of concern about the deficit and the debt. We've got this major bill that's passed the House, pending in the Senate. I hope they can get a good result, but it is going to involve a lot more spending and tax cuts. Trying to control spending is not easy. We found it out working with President Bush and even back to work with Reagan. Of course, you've got some pretty good results, but it took not months but years. Right now, I just don't see either party really saying this is a concern for the future of our country and for our children. It's going to take some strong leadership that I don't think we're really seeing right now.
That's the word. It seems to me it's leadership, and it's got to be leadership in both branches of government, the executive branch and the legislative branch. And as Trent said, I just don't think there isn't a lot of political pressure right now on either party or either branch of government to worry about the debt the way we should be. Economists are beginning to express themselves a little bit more vocally, and I'm glad to see it. But we're still, I still don't think there's a lot of political pressure around the debt, and there will be someday, because I don't think this is sustainable.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. I am paraphrasing a bit, but we have a question in the chat that was directed to one of you. I'm going to direct it to both of you. If you could speak a little about where you see the future of each of your parties going, just generally speaking, rebuilding, continuing building, etc.
Well, I'm an incurable optimist. Of course, Trump is sort of one of a kind. He's got the strong personality, and he's got holds a lot of sway in the Congress now. But I'm hoping that looking from the Republican standpoint, I feel good about our future. We've got some potentially good leaders out there with Vice President J.D. Vance. Marco Rubio, I think, is doing a really good job as Secretary of State. We've got some exciting governors. So I feel pretty good right now about the Republican Party. And of course, Trump is just such a dominating force right now. But if you look beyond this administration, who do we have in line? We got some good people. And I think that's true with the Democrats, too. They've got some outstanding governors that they're looking at.
I agree with Trent. You have to be optimistic, first of all. And I think, if anything, on the Democratic side, I'm ready for the next generation of young leaders and new leaders. I think it's time to turnover in politics is always essential. It's not only good, it's essential. And we need some turnover. We need more opportunities for people to begin to lead. And that new generation is just coming on, and there's a lot of governors and young legislators that I think can really make a big difference. So it's got to start with that. But I think Democrats really have to get their act together with regard to our brand and our messaging. I think we're becoming the party of the elite and the educated, and not the working class. And you've almost got an identity transformation where Republicans are now the working class and Democrats are the elite. Which was, when Trent and I were in, it was the other way around.
Yeah.
So we've got our work cut out for us, but it starts in part with new leadership.
All right, great. I have a couple more. These ones are a little bit quicker, I think. David from Virginia asked, do you think the legislative filibuster is likely to be eliminated, and which party do you think will ultimately be the one to eliminate it?
No, the filibuster will not be eliminated. Of course, there were a couple of threats in the last 2 years, but a couple of Democrats held the line. When you're into the leadership, the filibuster drives you crazy. But it's what makes the Senate special. I think Tom has always made the point that when Congress passes legislation that both parties really get involved and hammered out, and it's bipartisan, it has a tendency to be more productive and long lasting. And when it's passed by a very close vote, sometimes it's not as well received. So the filibuster is unique to the Senate, but I would plead with my colleagues, keep it, because as soon as you get rid of it, you'll wish you had it back.
Well, and I couldn't be more emphatically in agreement with Trent. It is what the Senate it should be all about. And this reconciliation bill is a good example of what happens when you don't have the filibuster. I mean, Republicans are understandably, because Democrats have done it too, they want to pass this on their own, and that's not the way to legislate. Trent and I think we both agree. We've talked about this so many times, but I've always believed that you got to make filibusters more painful. You got to make them hold the floor, but what we've done is eliminate the filibuster on nominations now. We've eliminated on budget, and I think it's just created more problems. We're going to have a lot more ideological nominees and judges than we used to have, because in the past you used to have bipartisan support to get a nominee passed, and now you don't need that anymore. So ideological purity is going to be more a factor. And then on the budget, you got these votoramas, which are just crazy things where you have 30 or 40 or 50 votes and nobody knows what they're voting for, and all these gotcha votes. It's just crazy. And it all happened because we eliminated the filibuster. And so I'd say keep the filibuster, but make it more painful.
There's even a process in the Senate where one senator can object and can put a hold on an issue, a bill, or vote. And Tom and I tried to change that a little bit. We wanted to require, I don't know what it was, Tom, 3 or 4 or 5 had to do it to put a hold. But I must say, one night, a little levity here, I was checking around. There was a hold on an issue. And I checked, and the Democrats said, "Oh, no, we don't have a hold." And I went back in the Republican cloakroom and said, who in the world, who has a hold on this? And the staff said, you do, Senator. And my energetic staff had put a hold on a bill in my name. That ain't the way the Senate, the United States Senate, is supposed to work. So, I managed to clear that hold and was pretty judicious about doing it in the future.
I'm gonna jump back in here. I have a few more questions. I know we're running out of time. This has been an incredible conversation. One thing I was curious about, and Lisa had touched on it with one of the audience questions about the future of the party. Senator Lott, I'm curious what you think happens in 2028. Does the MAGA movement continue? Who carries that mantle, or does it fizzle out? And do we see sort of a new form of conservatism? And then Senator Daschle, I'm curious, right now, Democrats are navigating this minority wilderness. You mentioned that they have a brand problem. There's been a lot of talk on Capitol Hill about what the best strategy for Republicans is right now as they navigate this moment, and try to push back on the Trump administration. What do you see as the best strategy they can use to have a salient message, sort of continue picking up the pieces from the 2024 election, but also prep for 26 and 28?
We're in a unique time here. The power of the personality and the MAGA movement is unique to Donald J. Trump. I think that his successor will be different in many ways. And I don't mean this to be overly complimentary or critical. I think maybe you'll see a return back to a little bit more traditional conservative Republican philosophy. Even though it might be people that will come out of the Trump administration, like J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio or others. And so, I do think you'll see some significant changes in the way the Republican Party goes after, Donald Trump.
I think the Democrats need to do some soul searching on how we communicate more effectively. I think we're getting beat maybe 10-1 in the social media right now. Most of the more popular social media sites are mostly all conservative. There are a couple of exceptions, but I don't think our messaging apparatus and infrastructure is working very well. I don't think we've been able to articulate a message, and that's partly because we don't really have an articulator at this point. That's always something a president can do effectively, but it's harder for members of Congress to get that national stage. But I think we need to work on that. But I think we really have to work on an agenda and come up with an agenda that has resonance, that might define us more effectively as we look to the coming elections, and then just see what we can do to be more competitive. I'm in a state that used to be a purple state. It's now a bright red state. And I'd like to see South Dakota become a purple state again. And one day I'm sure it will. But we've got to work on turning those red states and blue states that are consistently one color or the other more purple.
I'm sure the answer to this question will change several times over the next 3.5 years. But if fast forward November 2028, who do you guys think is each of your party's nominees, given where things currently are?
Well, Michael, yeah, you really jumping right into the fire. I've mentioned a couple of times J.D. Vance, vice president. He's got an interesting background, and he's got an opportunity to certainly make a name for himself. So part of it will depend on how he does in the shadow of Donald Trump. I'm a big fan of Marco Rubio. I like his demeanor. I've been watching him in some of his speeches recently, and I think we have some women in the party. I'm very excited that Susan Collins of Maine, chairman of the Appropriations Committee, comes from a tough state. I mean, she comes from a blue state. She's had a tough time, but so we got some good people out there, and I'm looking forward to the future. But I do think both parties need to be looking for that next generation.
And I think on the Democratic side, I'm really impressed. We've got at least a half a dozen governors that could become real effective national candidates. You're beginning to see them surface a little bit more and become more vocal, and I think that's good. And they're men and women, as Trent said. I'm hopeful that we can continue to see that trend going forward.
Shifting gears a little bit back to the conversation about bipartisanship, there have been some examples in recent years of bipartisanship up on Capitol Hill. We saw the bipartisan gun safety law. We saw the bipartisan infrastructure bill. I'm curious, what area do you both think could be the next in that list of areas for ripe for bipartisan cooperation?
Well, I think foreign policy is a place where you must have bipartisanship. Congress, in many ways, has abdicated their role, which can be, really effective because of the appropriations process. That's a place where I'm really concerned. I'm not comfortable at all right now with where we are with regard to Ukraine and Russia. What are we doing? What can we do to more? I know the president wants to see the fighting stop, but we need to be doing something different to deal with that and be prepared to deal with international relations around the world.
I totally agree with Trent on that. I think internationally we really have even more of a role and opportunity for Congress. And I think it's so essential right now, especially with regard to Ukraine. I think there's a new field that that's going to require bipartisanship, and that's all around AI, artificial intelligence, and where that's all headed and how we deal with it. I think Congress has begun to start working together a little bit on that, and I think we could use a lot more engagement on the part of both parties and both houses as we look to how impactful AI is going to be in coming years.
I certainly agree with Tom on that. Yeah.
A lot of agreement just in this conversation. It's a good model for lawmakers up on Capitol Hill. We are almost out of time, but just to close things out, I wanted to ask you both, what gives you hope about the future of bipartisanship in Washington, on Capitol Hill, and the entire country? We've spoken about the way that you two worked so closely and so well together when you were serving in Congress, where of course we've also touched on the political moment that we're living in right now with such fierce polarization. I'm curious, what gives you hope for the future that bipartisanship can continue to shine through?
Well, it has to. I don't want to get partisan, but I do think that another South Dakotan, John Thune, has done a good job with the nominations. He's trying to deal with the Senate, but also how the Senate deals with Trump. I think Michael Johnson, the Speaker, who is riding the whirlwind, with the close numbers they have in the House. But I've seen some signs, for instance, that he has been reaching out to work with the leadership on the Democratic side, and I would encourage him to continue to do that.
Well, I believe, as Trent and I both believe, that necessity is the mother of invention, and I think it is, as he just said, it's necessary. It's a necessity. We've got to, our democracy depends on our ability to govern and to be functional in our governance, and that requires leadership. It requires courage, and it requires good communication. And I'm hopeful that we're going to see more of that in the coming months and years.
On that note, Senator Daschle, Senator Lott, thank you so much for joining us for a really fascinating, uplifting conversation. To our viewers, thank you so much for tuning in and being part of the conversation with your questions. Again, thank you for everyone for joining. And
Mychael, I want to say thank you to The Hill. I read it every morning just so I'll know what's going on The Hill.
Thank you so much.
Same
we
here.
appreciate that. Thank you.
Bet.
TheHill.com for the latest on politics and policy. Again, Senators Daschle and Senator Lott, thank you so much for joining us.